Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorjan. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, we've got an interesting topic to discuss today. It's taking a look at policies, government policies, not just in the West, not just in Europe, not just in Russia, Japan, etc., but all over the world. The refugee crisis is causing many governments to have to really look hard at the policy that they've implemented over the past 10 to 20 years. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion. And which region of the world do you want to start?
Well, obviously, first, thanks as well, Ken. Obviously, I appreciate you joining me as well. Yeah, we thought it was an interesting subject because we're approaching it from a completely different angle. And I think an angle that doesn't get discussed. It's extremely important because we are making policy decisions a lot of the time in the West that's causing these kind of problems. And I think now we're starting to see in some quarters a realization we have to do something to stop this. But this, in trying to stop these problems, then suddenly we're going to have to make these enormous geopolitical and political U-turn on established policy. And let's start with Ukraine, because Ukraine's a European nation. We know already there has been millions of refugees who've left Ukraine and gone to Russia. Also, millions have gone to Europe. I think it's maybe 3 or 4 million, not sure, but a substantial amount. Now, Europe already is complaining that it can't take any more of them because it just doesn't have the facilities to do it, but we're not here to discuss that specifically. More the question is, what's going to happen in the future? And the problem for Ukraine is multifold. First, obviously, assuming the outcome of the war is that Russia controls increasingly large regions of the country, you are going to inevitably get Ukrainians who simply will not want to live in those regions and may end up seeking to leave Ukraine and want to go as far away from Ukraine because they're terrified that the Russians will come and take over a region they move to next. Such is the fear and the paranoia, etc., that exists. So that's a number one problem. Number two problem, and we've mentioned this before, is the issue of the fact that Russia's destroyed huge amounts of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So the risk is when we get into the depths of winter, millions more Ukrainians might look to have refugee status and leave Ukraine, as well as the ongoing war, which might create even more refugees. So we decided in our infinite wisdom to back Ukraine in a proxy war with Russia. Effectively, they were just a convenient tool to try and destroy Russia. And of course, it's failed, and we're not here to discuss the Ukraine war in that regard. But the basic and simple bottom line is, as a result of idiotic policy decisions, not only is Ukraine being destroyed internally, economically, societally, financially, politically, but also because of our idiotic, crass actions collectively. And the West, I mean, you can basically bunch all the NATO countries. They're all now suddenly extremely worried and angry that there could be a risk of millions of Ukrainians flooding Europe with a refugee status, and quite legitimately. And of course, they've taken others. The argument is, well, you should continue taking them. And of course, they're not in any position to take that many. So what's going to happen to them? Where do they go? And this is why we're starting to hear noises in Europe about we're going to have to do something to sort out Ukraine's energy needs. So they're recognizing this problem. There's nothing they can do to resolve the problem, and certainly not within 2 or 3 months when you get into the depths of winter. So again, it's the law of unintended consequences. Because they thought Ukraine would triumph rapidly and Russia would lose, they never actually asked themselves what happens in this situation if Ukraine loses, which they're losing the war very clearly. And therefore, you have an enormous refugee crisis, which could end up 3, 4, 5, 6, who knows, 8 million Ukrainians who will not go to Russia. They'll certainly want to go to the West. So where are they going to go to? Poland, Hungary, the immediate. And there's an argument that says the first country they arrive in, that's where they have to reside. Well, these countries have already said we can't take any of them. So that's just one example of a massive refugee crisis, which has come about through our geopolitical stupidity in the West. And now suddenly there's noises about, well, we can't allow this to happen. Well, how are we going to stop it? Well, you have to end the war. Well, we can't end the war because it's political suicide, because we've put all this political capital in supporting Ukraine. Well, you're going to have to do something. So there are already kind of noises, well, we're going to have to end the war. We don't want to. And because they've dug this gigantic hole for themselves, they have no way out of it. And that's just a classic example. And we're going to list a whole bunch of others that exactly the same problems happening. And the argument is quite clear that we, through our policy decisions, have caused this. And because we didn't think any of this through and imagine for a moment that Ukraine would lose. And in the coming months, this could turn into a huge refugee crisis alone from Ukraine. And as I say, where are they going to go? They can't go east because it's Russia, and they're not going to go to Belarus. So all they're going to do is head west. And which countries are going to then say we're prepared to take them? And what happens if they end up in Poland? Poland's going to shift them all on. Where to? Germany, and Germany's going to then shift them on to where? And which countries in Europe now, given all the economic financial problems, is going to be capable of being able to take all these refugees from just Ukraine alone? Well, no one can. No one can afford to do it, let alone if they even got the capability to do it, because this creates housing problems alone. Where are you going to put them? And therefore, it becomes an extremely difficult problem. And of course, the question is, come the end of the war, when the war's over, how many of them are not going to want to go back for a whole variety of reasons? And then what's the situation then? So it creates an enormous problem. And I think finally, at least some heads cool heads in Europe are realizing it. But what do? There's no way out of this mess.
Yeah, there's a quote that came from German MEP Maximilian Krah recently, just the last couple of days. The refugee crisis does not work, not even economically. The German government is expected to need 10 billion euros more in welfare payments starting in 2025. That's one country with one instance of having to deal with this influx of refugees. Now, I think the biggest thing, as opposed to where you had in the past, and we're going to get to Russia, where they are actually integrating a policy, Japan, which may soon be integrating a policy, is if you are not prepared for an influx of asylum seekers, refugees, those coming from war-torn countries, etc. If you don't have something prepared and just open the doors and say, welcome, come on in. And then what the EU has done has forced all the nations within the EU to have to take their fair share. The problem is that you're just taking unskilled, usually illiterate individuals who can't speak the language, throwing them right into the middle of downtown and wreaking havoc on the social construct and social fabric of your nation. And we're seeing that all across the board. We don't have to get into details or lay that out, but in many ways, refugees do get victimized by the media, but the reality is they're in just as much dire straits as the people of the society they're thrown into. Because the government policies simply created an ideological motive without preparing for potentially what was going to happen. How do you integrate them? How do you get somebody from their culture to be the mediator in between, yada, yada, yada. All of a sudden, it's just, you're throwing chaos in there. And because we're seeing more and more and more and more conflicts over the last 20 to 25 years in the West Asian, in the Middle East, and I'm sorry, the Balkans, in what's going on around the world, the amount and number of refugees that are seeking to get out of those war-torn areas is probably 1,000 times more than you would have seen even following World War II.
Yeah, and let's take West Asia as a great example because of the Israeli-Palestine or Israeli-Hamas war. And obviously the risk of any conflict like that is you're going to have refugees. Where do they go? But then there's another angle to this, as well, as bad as that is, whereby there is the risk of this war escalating between Israel and Hezbollah, which means Israel and Lebanon. And this is why suddenly the Europeans and the Americans and the UK and West Asian countries were all saying there has to be a ceasefire immediately. This war has to end. And part of that reasoning is because of the refugee crisis this can create. And it can work one of two ways or both ways, depending on the escalation. If the escalation is horrendous, you could see millions of Israelis looking to leave Israel, and already at least 500,000 have left. And they'll want to go where? Maybe a lot want to go to the US, but they certainly want to get out of parts of Israel. The same can happen in Lebanon with refugees looking to get out. Where are they going to go? They're going to pile into Syria, and Syria is going to say we can't have them. So where do they, down the end of the situation, where do they go? Do they go to Turkey? And then Turkey's going to move them on. And I think finally there's another realization that if we don't deal with these problems, not only is war abhorrent and an escalation is going to plunge, might plunge the whole of West Asia into a conflict, and then you're going to have even more refugees trying to leave and go somewhere across the whole region. So that's another example of where we allow policy decisions to be made geopolitically and things start to escalate and get out of hand. And I think finally, with regards to Israel and Hezbollah, there's a near universal realization that this could potentially not only spiral in terms of the war itself, but we're going to have a refugee crisis of enormous proportions. So even the US is thinking this, because the US, rightly in their mind, thinks, well, if millions of Israelis want to leave, a huge percentage of them will say we want to go to the US. And now the US is going to say, we're not taking you. And of course, the US has the added problem from a political standpoint of the Israeli lobby, and therefore there's going to be an enormous backlash from that. And of course, they have huge influence politically. So again, this is another example where we allow conflicts to start. Okay, this is a more complicated situation, but in the end, you have to deal with the problem. And because if you don't, then it can engulf the whole of West Asia. And Syria's got a refugee crisis problem anyway still. And that relates to what happens to the Kurds. Are they in Turkey or are they in northern Syria? Then you've got the issue of the Kurds in Iraq, and that's never going to get resolved. So the risk is a conflict could then see more and more of those refugees spilling into wherever, be it from Turkey into Syria or Syria into Turkey, and the risk and the scope of this problem is so big, because a regional war in West Asia will see exactly that problem. And that's another reason why, people always jump to conclusions that the United States wants a regional war. It doesn't want a regional war in any way, shape, or form. And neither does anyone else want a regional war, because not just the risk of what it might do in terms of the war itself, but the consequences of doing this. Because finally, there seems to be a recognition that, again, the rest of the world is in no position to absorb these refugees. And, you know, and in West Asia, that would be a place where there'll be so much displacement. I mean, yes, quite a lot of them might try to leave and go to the US or try to somehow get into Europe. And this has happened before. It happened due to, obviously, the war in Syria, which started in 2011. Again, that was the West trying to get rid of Assad. And here we are, okay, to a large extent, the war isn't happening anymore, but there's still conflict zones. There's still the problem and the risk of another refugee crisis. So there's West Asia. And then we can talk, well, I'll let you obviously speak now, Ken, because I'm going to go on about the problems in Africa again.
Yeah, but I'll let you go and do the Africa. I want to go ahead and focus on Central and South America real quick. It isn't just conflict and war that can create policy that pushes refugees from a country. For decades now, we've had refugees come to America from Cuba. Why? Because of economic sanctions imposed upon Cuba by the United States. That same thing is now happening en masse from Venezuela because of the sanctions, the accusations of the validity of elections going down there. And so suddenly, you know, in the case of Cuba, they've tried to keep their citizens in, but the refugees have you know, traversed and even sometimes at the cost of their lives to get out of the country. But potentially, and I'm not saying this is absolute, but it is kind of coincidental, could the force of refugees into the United States through Venezuela and the pass there be a policy that's being pushed by the government in order to wreak havoc, you know, a retaliation against the United States? So war is not the only thing that creates refugees. Sometimes it's an economic thing based on an ideological foreign policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And with regards to Africa, we know countries like Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso have been shedding the neo-colonial problems in the last couple of years, particularly. And of course, yes, there's controversy because they replaced governments with a military government, or juntas as people call them. But now, unsurprisingly, as the Western influence is being basically kicked out of these countries, suddenly there's been this massive escalation. I'm not saying ISIS and those kind of organizations didn't have a presence, but they've certainly upped the amount of attacks they're making. They're starting to move into the major cities instead of the rural areas. But there's now a big concern in Europe, particularly. Suddenly they're going, hang on a minute, we could have another refugee crisis because loads of people are going to pile out of there. What are they going to do? They're going to head up and they're going to go for Spain and Portugal, etc. And these countries going, well, again, we can't take this. But the question is, and we're not here to deliberate this particular aspect, although I think a lot of people feel the answer is very obvious. Who's financing or ISIS, etc.? Why have they suddenly all relocated largely from West Asia and they're now rolled up into Africa just as the West gets kicked out of there? Is that a coincidence? Well, you make your own judgment on that. But at the end of the day, this is, again, more political decisions that are made that are having these kind of consequences. And again, in this case, Europe's looking at this and going, we can't deal with this. And absolutely they can't. Because again, what happens if millions of people try to relocate because of this problem with ISIS? And obviously these African countries are told, well, you're not coming back. We don't want you here because of all that havoc you wreaked yourself from decades and way beyond decades. So again, this is another situation where through Western meddling, Western interference, we're now starting to have this backlash. And again, questions are being asked, inside Europe about foreign policy decisions. And now a lot of European countries want to engage with these military juntas and saying we need to engage them because we can't allow this massive influx of refugees leaving these countries. So what can we do to try and prevent that? So, I mean, but again, this has been going on for far too long. So they're just some obvious things. You've highlighted South America. Ken, we've talked about Africa. We've talked about West Asia. We've talked about Ukraine and being a European nation. And then there's the opposite side, and we'll briefly mention, and we have talked about this before, where Russia is very keen to encourage people from Western countries. If you want to live by our rules and our traditions, you're welcome to come and live here, and you can eventually, in 3 years, get permanent residency. Now, there's no doubt Russia will be very picky as to who they allow into the country. In some part, they'll want skilled people or people who are prepared to work. Maybe there's going to be a lot of laboring jobs as well, but basically the risk is they'll take enormous amounts of skills out of Western countries, because in the next decade, millions could go there, maybe 10 million, maybe more. I mean, Russia can take huge amounts of people and it's prepared to do that. Well, therefore, then we start to have a kind of brain drain risk out of European countries, for example, going to Russia. Clearly, not everyone's going to go. So then we start to have that kind of problem where then what do we do with skill shortages in European countries? So, and again, what's driving this policy decision? Well, because I'm not getting into that subject, but we know why a lot of people are getting kind of fed up with issues going on in Europe and saying, well, maybe Russia's an alternative. For a lot of people, they would never go to Russia, but there's a lot of people who might think it's a good idea to go and live there. So again, we make policy decisions, and we're going to have to reap what we've sown. And you made the point, Ken, about Japan. And Japan, because of its demographic problem, wants to attract people. Well, again, where are they going to come from? And what's the chance that a lot of people from the West might head to global South countries in the future because they think there's more opportunity? And we don't have the opportunity in the West because we've destroyed and deindustrialized, Germany being an example. Again, what caused that? A lack of access to cheap Russian energy. That was a policy decision. So again, it just shows we make decisions, we reap what we've sown, and it's having a disastrous effect on Western countries. And the risk is this will continue to grow. And this is why I think this is a far more important angle than all the other nonsense that people take sides and make statements that is wholly unhelpful. I think we need to start with policy decisions and go, we need to look carefully at what we're doing in the West and how we're going to have to stop doing these things, because we're creating huge problems that ultimately is boomeranging on us. And we're in no position anymore for all the problems we have economically, financially, etc., to take these people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm reminded of a 1957 black and white movie, really famous, called 12 Angry Men. And I don't know if you saw it, Paul, but it was about a jury. And 1957 was an interesting year because it was just a few years after Brown versus Board of Education ending segregation. And it was also one generation after the biggest immigration movement into the United States ever. 1900, 1920 was about a generation after that. And you could see in the dialogue that there were people who grew up in the 1920s, 1930s and saw and lived through this. And they would refer to them, the Italians against the Greeks and the Little Russia and all these different conclaves. It wasn't a racist type of mentality. It was more socioeconomic. And I think when people have to look at, this influx into their countries, more often than not, it has nothing to do with racism. It's just you're bringing in so many people with different ideas and values and cultures throwing them all into once, and it creates chaos and havoc. Eventually, people will learn to live with one another more often than not. But this type of struggle is absolutely what we're seeing in Europe and going on perhaps in the US and other places, because it's all happening at once. I think really as we go down the line, and this is the thought I had about the rise of the global South, is throughout history, migration has taken place from one economically viable place. As it dies out, people move to find the next one. And I think we're going to, as you said with Russia, we're going to start to see within 20 to 30 years, as the global South rises, there's going to be an influx of people looking for work, looking for a better life, as the West dies out due to their bad policies and their destructive ways, and more to the global South, which is building the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I think with that, we chewed enough over this. It's a huge subject, but I think that's a good starting point to make people think differently about a huge problem that does exist, and we need to deal with this, and we need to deal with it in a mature, adult-like way, and not how we're dealing with things now, which is just wholly unhelpful.
Absolutely. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion.
And likewise.
And to everybody here, thank you for being a part of the Sirius Report community. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment. That helps the algorithm. And let anybody know that you think this would be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.